April 1943, 27,000 feet above France. The German pilot squinted through his canopy and laughed. Below him, climbing slowly through the thin blue air, was the largest single-engine fighter he had ever seen. Thick, heavy, awkward. "That's their new fighter?" he said over the radio. "It flies like a milk bottle." His wingmen laughed with him. They had fought Spitfires. They had fought Hurricanes. They knew what a dangerous aircraft looked like. This wasn't it. What they didn't know, what none of them could know, was that within 18 months that same aircraft would help grind the Luftwaffe into collapse. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't win respect with elegance. It earned it with firepower. And by 1945, no one was laughing anymore. April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above northern France. The air was thin, brittle, and perfectly clear, the kind of cold blue emptiness where contrails hung like chalk marks across a slate sky. Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Keller of Jagdgeschwader 26 adjusted his oxygen mask and leaned slightly forward in the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190A4. Below him, climbing slowly through the scattered haze, came something new, something large, something awkward. He squinted, then smirked. "Was ist das?" he muttered. "That's a fighter?" The shapes below were enormous. Thick fuselages, broad wings, oversized radial engines. They climbed heavily, almost laboriously, nothing like the lean Spitfires he had fought over the Channel or the agile Soviet Yaks he had heard about from the Eastern Front. These machines looked swollen, overbuilt, unrefined. One of his wingmen's voices crackled over the radio. "They fly like milk bottles." Laughter followed. The aircraft were Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, 16 of them from the U.S. 4th Fighter Group, making some of their earliest combat sweeps over occupied Europe. To the German pilots watching from above, they appeared absurd. At nearly 7 tons loaded, the P-47 outweighed every single engine fighter in the European theater. Its fuselage was barrel-shaped. Its canopy sat high and bulbous. The enormous Pratt Whitney R2800 radial engine gave it a blunt, almost industrial look, more machine than animal. The Luftwaffe pilots had spent years refining the art of aerial combat. They believed in climb rate, turn performance, acceleration. Energy advantage meant life. A fighter was supposed to be lean, precise, responsive. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 climbed quickly and turned tightly. The Focke-Wulf 190 rolled with violent speed and struck like a blade. By comparison, the Thunderbolt looked like a freight wagon with wings. And in those early encounters, the Germans seemed justified. When the formations finally met that morning, the FW-190s dove from superior altitude with the sun behind them. The Thunderbolts tried to maneuver defensively, but their climb rate at lower altitudes was unimpressive. They could not outturn the German fighters. Several American pilots, new to combat and unfamiliar with their aircraft's limits, attempted turning engagements and paid the price. In the weeks that followed, more P-47s fell. The Luftwaffe's veterans reported confidently to their superiors. The new American fighter was heavy, slow to respond, and vulnerable if forced into classic dogfights. British RAF observers were skeptical as well. Many American pilots had transitioned from Spitfires into the Thunderbolt and privately wondered if they had been handed the wrong machine. The Spitfire felt alive, light on the controls, quick to climb. The P-47 felt mechanical, immense, demanding. It required strength on takeoff. It punished sloppy landings. It dove so fast that early pilots experienced compressibility effects they barely understood, controls stiffening as shockwaves formed over the wings. In training accidents alone, units converting to the Thunderbolt suffered painful losses. The aircraft demanded respect, and it gave no forgiveness to inexperience. Yet buried inside that awkward silhouette was something the early critics failed to grasp. The Thunderbolt had not been designed as a lightweight duelist. It was conceived in 1940, when Europe was collapsing under German air superiority. American planners had feared facing high-altitude bombers and fighters operating far above conventional performance ceilings. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, chose a radical path. Instead of shaving weight, he embraced power. The P-47 carried the 18-cylinder Pratt Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. More importantly, it employed an advanced turbo-supercharger system mounted deep within the fuselage. Exhaust gases were routed through long ducts to spin the turbine, compressing incoming air and allowing the engine to maintain sea-level power at altitudes where most fighters choked for oxygen. At 25,000 to 30,000 feet, the Thunderbolt was operating in its natural habitat. But in early 1943, few American pilots fully understood how to exploit that advantage. They attempted to fly it like a Spitfire. They tried to dogfight, and the Germans kept laughing. Combat reports from Jagdgeschwader units during that spring described the Thunderbolt as large and slow in turning combat. Spitfire. German pilots were confident they could outclimb it at medium altitude and outmaneuver it below 20,000 feet. They learned to attack from beneath, where the Thunderbolt's bulk made defensive visibility difficult. They forced engagements into horizontal turning fights, where weight became liability. American losses mounted modestly but noticeably. The Luftwaffe still held initiative over much of Western Europe. For experienced German aces, these encounters felt routine, another new Allied aircraft to be studied, exploited, and dismissed. But something else was happening in those same encounters. Something subtle, unsettling. German pilots began noticing how hard the Thunderbolt was to kill. Where a Spitfire might catch fire from a short cannon burst, the P-47 often continued flying. Its radial engine, lacking vulnerable liquid cooling lines, could absorb punishment that would cripple an inline engine instantly. Its airframe was massive, its structure reinforced. Armor plate protected the pilot. The fuel tanks were better shielded than most Axis designs. More than one German pilot reported pouring ammunition into a Thunderbolt only to watch it dive away trailing smoke, not falling, not breaking apart, simply leaving. The Americans began to notice it too. Pilots who survived their first chaotic combats returned with stories of damage that should have been fatal. Wings punctured, fuselages shredded, engines coughing but still producing power. The Thunderbolt was not elegant. It was not graceful. But it endured. And endurance in air warfare changes the psychology of both hunter and hunted. By late spring 1943, American squadron leaders were re-evaluating their tactics. They began to recognize that the Thunderbolt's weight, so mocked, gave it extraordinary diving acceleration. From high altitude, it could convert potential energy into speed faster than almost any opponent. In a dive, the P-47 became something entirely different, not a lumbering milk bottle, but a falling anvil. The aircraft that struggled to climb aggressively below 15,000 feet became dominant above 25,000. It could dive away from danger at speeds that risked structural failure in lighter fighters. German pilots attempting pursuit often found themselves forced to break off as the Thunderbolt accelerated beyond safe limits. The laughter did not stop immediately, but it grew less frequent. The P-47 was not what the Luftwaffe expected from a fighter. It did not fit their theory of air combat. It did not behave according to their experience. It absorbed damage. It refused to die easily. And in certain regimes of altitude and speed, it hinted at something dangerous. What German pilots were witnessing in 1943 was not a failed fighter. They were watching a weapon still learning how to be used. And when its pilots finally understood it, when they stopped trying to turn with Messerschmitts and began to think vertically, aggressively, methodically, the skies over Europe would change in ways no one laughing that April morning could yet imagine. By the summer of 1943, something had shifted inside the American fighter groups stationed in England. The laughter from German cockpits still echoed in early combat reports, but inside briefing rooms at Debden, Halesworth, and Boxted, a different tone was emerging. The Thunderbolt was not failing. It was being misused. The realization did not come from theory. It came from survival. Pilots who lived through their first encounters began comparing notes. Again and again, the pattern repeated itself. If they tried to dogfight horizontally, they were vulnerable. If they attempted to outturn a Bf-109 at medium altitude, they bled energy quickly. But when they dove from high altitude, fired, and climbed back using speed instead of tight turns, they lived. And often, the German did not. The Thunderbolt was not a rapier. It was a hammer. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group became one of the central figures in redefining how the P-47 would be flown. Zemke was analytical, aggressive, and willing to discard pre-war dogma. He drilled his pilots relentlessly, maintain altitude advantage, stay fast, attack in coordinated formations, and never surrender energy in unnecessary turning fights. Speed is life became the quiet mantra. The P-47's true strength lay in energy retention. Its sheer mass, nearly twice that of some enemy fighters, meant that once accelerated, it carried momentum like a falling locomotive. In a dive from 30,000 feet, a Thunderbolt could exceed 500 miles per hour. German pilots attempting to follow risked structural damage or loss of control. The Americans began exploiting this advantage systematically. The tactic was simple in theory, brutal in execution. Climb above the bomber formations. Stay higher than the intercepting German fighters. When the enemy committed to an attack, roll inverted and dive in coordinated pairs or flights. Fire at high closure speed, then extend away in a shallow dive before converting speed back into altitude in a wide climbing arc. It was not glamorous. It was not cinematic dogfighting. It was controlled violence applied with discipline. And it began to work. The Thunderbolt's 850 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, were another revelation once properly employed. Each gun carried roughly 400 rounds. Combined, the aircraft could deliver more sustained fire than any single-engine fighter in the European theater. German fighters often relied on 20mm cannon with limited ammunition capacity, devastating when they hit, but limited in duration. The P-47, by contrast, could hold the trigger and maintain a stream of heavy machine gun fire for extended bursts. At convergence range, typically set between 250 and 400 yards, all 8 guns created a dense cone of projectiles. Even brief hits could shred control surfaces, puncture fuel tanks, or incapacitate pilots. What mattered was not a single explosive shell. It was probability. In August 1943, during the increasingly costly daylight bombing campaigns over Germany, the Thunderbolt began to demonstrate what it had been built for: high-altitude escort. The U.S. Army Air Forces were pushing B-17 and B-24 formations deeper into occupied Europe. German interceptors rose to meet them in coordinated waves. At 25,000 to 30,000 feet, the air grew thin. Engines strained. Performance margins narrowed. Here, the Thunderbolt felt different. Its turbo-supercharger allowed the R2800 engine to maintain power where mechanically supercharged German engines began to fade. While the Bf-109 and FW-190 remained formidable, their edge was no longer decisive at extreme altitude. The Americans could climb higher, linger longer, and dive with terrifying speed. German combat reports from late 1943 began to reflect frustration. Thunderbolts were increasingly seen above bomber formations instead of level with them. They attacked from superior altitude. They refused turning engagements. They dove away when disadvantaged. Several Luftwaffe pilots noted that pursuit in steep dives became hazardous. The P-47 simply accelerated beyond comfortable limits. More troubling still was its durability. American gun camera footage showed Thunderbolts returning with shredded skin panels, punctured wings, and engines coughing oil, yet still airborne. The radial engine absorbed damage differently than inline engines. A hit that might rupture a coolant line in a Messerschmitt and force immediate engine seizure could leave a Thunderbolt wounded but functional. This resilience altered the psychology of combat. German pilots were accustomed to short, lethal engagements. A well-placed burst could end a fight. But with the P-47, certainty eroded. A Thunderbolt might be hit repeatedly and still dive away, regroup, and return minutes later with full firepower. For the American pilots, this toughness built confidence. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, flying with the 56th Fighter Group, would later become one of the highest-scoring American aces in Europe. Early in his combat tour, he experienced firsthand how much punishment the Thunderbolt could endure. Though individual stories varied, the broader pattern was clear. The aircraft gave its pilot a second chance more often than its opponents did, and second chances win wars of attrition. As autumn approached, the transformation accelerated. P-47 groups refined their formations, tightened discipline, and integrated more effectively with bomber streams. They learned to anticipate German attack vectors. They learned to coordinate vertical maneuvers instead of chasing individual duels. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, faced mounting strain. Experienced pilots were irreplaceable. Fuel supplies were tightening. Allied bombing targeted aircraft factories and synthetic fuel plants. Every engagement became costlier. The Thunderbolt was no longer an object of humor. It was becoming an obstacle, one that could not easily be brushed aside. In October 1943, during large-scale bomber raids into central Germany, Luftwaffe fighter leaders began reporting that American escorts were increasingly aggressive at altitude. Thunderbolts were no longer reacting. They were initiating. The skies above 28,000 feet, once comfortable hunting grounds for German interceptors, were becoming contested. The Americans had not built the most elegant fighter in the war. They had built a machine designed for sustained combat in a war of production, fuel, and endurance. It could take damage. It could dive faster than its opponents. It carried more ammunition than its adversaries expected. And now, finally, it was being flown the way it had been engineered to be flown. The laughter that had greeted its arrival in April had faded into silence. In its place came calculation. German pilots began advising caution when engaging Thunderbolts above 25,000 feet. They recommended avoiding prolonged dives in pursuit. They emphasized surprise attacks and rapid disengagement. Confidence was being replaced by risk assessment. The P-47 had not changed physically, but its reputation had, and reputation in air combat is almost as lethal as firepower. By the end of 1943, the Thunderbolt had not yet owned the sky. The Luftwaffe remained dangerous, experienced, and deadly. But the balance was shifting. The Americans were learning faster than the Germans could adapt. Industrial output ensured replacements. Training pipelines produced new pilots at rates Germany struggled to match. The Thunderbolt had stopped trying to be something it was not. Now it was becoming exactly what it was designed to be. And the true reckoning, the moment when German pilots would no longer debate its weaknesses but fear its presence, was approaching with the winter clouds of 1944. Winter gave way to spring in 1944 under a sky that no longer belonged to Germany. The change did not happen in a single battle. It came gradually, through attrition, through industry, through adaptation. By early 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer experimenting with its identity. It had found it. And in doing so, it began to impose a new reality on the Luftwaffe. The transformation became unmistakable during the renewed Allied bomber offensive over the Reich. American strategy had hardened into something relentless. Daylight bombing escorted deep into Germany. Synthetic fuel plants, aircraft factories, rail junctions, ball bearing works, the heart of industrial capacity. And with improved drop tanks, the P-47 could now escort bombers farther than before. Not yet to Berlin and back, that would increasingly become the role of the P-51 Mustang, but far enough to force German fighters into sustained engagements under unfavorable conditions. The Thunderbolt's presence at high altitude grew denser. Above 25,000 feet, its turbo-supercharged engine performed with confidence. The R-2800 did not gasp in the thin air, it roared. With the introduction of improved propellers, broad-bladed paddle types that bit aggressively into the atmosphere, climb performance sharpened noticeably. Acceleration improved. The aircraft felt less sluggish, more decisive. German pilots noticed. In February 1944, during the massive Big Week bombing offensive targeting German aircraft production, waves of American bombers crossed into heavily defended airspace. The Luftwaffe rose in strength, determined to break the raids before they crippled the factories that sustained them. The sky became layered with contrails, bombers in tight formations, interceptors climbing from below, escorts weaving above. And there, increasingly confident and disciplined, flew the Thunderbolts. The old tactic of forcing them into turning contests had lost effectiveness. The Americans refused the invitation. They remained high. They attacked in diving passes. They broke away in speed. German fighters attempting to regroup often found Thunderbolts already repositioning above them. The psychological shift was subtle but measurable. Previously, Luftwaffe pilots attacked bombers first and dealt with escorts afterward. Now they faced aggressive interference before even reaching their targets. The P-47s were not merely defending, they were hunting. 8 heavy machine guns firing in synchronized convergence created a lethal geometry in the air. German aircraft struck in a diving pass often disintegrated under sustained bursts. Control surfaces shredded, fuel ignited, engines seized. While a single 20mm shell could destroy, it required precision. The Thunderbolt's battery required proximity and discipline, and by 1944, American pilots had both. Gun camera footage from this period reveals a change in tone. Thunderbolts did not fire wildly. They closed deliberately, often within 300 yards, and held steady bursts that walked across wings and fuselages. German fighters attempting evasive rolls frequently found themselves crossing through dense streams of fire rather than isolated cannon shots. And if they struck back? The Thunderbolt absorbed punishment in ways that defied expectation. Its radial engine, shielded by a large frontal mass, could continue operating despite damage that would cripple liquid-cooled engines instantly. Armor plating behind the pilot reduced fatal cockpit hits. Control cables were often duplicated. Structural members were overbuilt. Pilots returned to English airfields with aircraft torn and battered, yet intact. Each safe landing reinforced belief. Each damaged but surviving aircraft denied the Luftwaffe a kill. By March 1944, German fighter strength was under strain. Experienced leaders were falling at a pace that training schools could not compensate. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer flight hours, less gunnery practice, and limited exposure to complex tactical coordination. Fuel shortages reduced training time further. Meanwhile, American production surged. Replacement Thunderbolts arrived in crates. Replacement pilots arrived with hundreds of training hours. attrition began to tilt decisively. The P-47's dominance expanded beyond altitude. As Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, the Thunderbolt transitioned into a new and devastating role: ground attack. What had once been mocked as too large for fighter combat proved ideal for carrying ordnance. The aircraft could mount bombs beneath its wings and fuselage. Later, rockets were added. Its rugged structure tolerated low-altitude stress and small arms fire better than lighter aircraft. When the invasion of Normandy began in June 1944, the skies above the beaches were layered with Allied air cover. Thunderbolts patrolled from low level to high altitude. German attempts to reach the invasion fleet or strike beachheads during daylight met overwhelming resistance. But it was on the roads of France that fear deepened. German columns moving during daylight hours became targets. The distinctive rumble of a diving Thunderbolt, its propeller tips slicing near supersonic speeds, became a warning signal. Pilots descended fast, releasing bombs, firing rockets, and finishing passes with heavy machine gun bursts that tore through vehicles and supply convoys. To infantry and armored units alike, the P-47 became more than a fighter. It became airborne artillery with precision. The Luftwaffe attempted to contest airspace over Normandy and later during the Allied breakout across France, but every sortie grew more dangerous. Thunderbolts now flew in numbers. They stacked at multiple altitudes. They coordinated tightly. They dove as pairs or flights, and they returned to base more often than not. German pilots began advising extreme caution. Reports emphasized avoiding engagement unless possessing clear numerical or positional advantage. The old dismissive language vanished from operational summaries. Where once they had joked about milk bottles, they now calculated fuel consumption, altitude margins, and escape vectors before committing. Some still fought bravely, many with remarkable skill. But the environment had changed. Air superiority was slipping from German hands, and the P-47 was part of the reason. It did not replace the Mustang as the long-range escort icon of the war. It did not turn like a Spitfire or climb like a lightweight interceptor at low altitude. It did not fit the romantic image of a dueling fighter. Instead, it embodied something else: inevitability. Industrial strength translated into mechanical durability. Mechanical durability translated into pilot survival. Pilot survival translated into experience. Experience translated into tactical discipline. And tactical discipline, backed by numbers and altitude, translated into control of the sky. By late 1944, the laughter that had greeted the Thunderbolt 18 months earlier felt like a relic from another war. The aircraft that seemed too heavy, too blunt, too inelegant had become a persistent and inescapable presence. It was no longer misunderstood. It was respected. And increasingly, it was feared. By the winter of 1944-45, the Luftwaffe still possessed aircraft. It still possessed courage. What it no longer possessed was control. The transformation that had begun with quiet laughter in 1943 ended in a sky dominated by contrails bearing American stars. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once dismissed as clumsy and overbuilt, had become one of the pillars of that dominance. The final phase of the air war over Europe was not defined by elegant dogfights. It was defined by pressure. Constant pressure. German airfields were bombed. Fuel depots were targeted relentlessly. Synthetic fuel plants, already strained, struggled to meet demand. Training hours for new pilots dropped to fractions of what had once been standard. Veterans who survived were rotated constantly, exhausted and irreplaceable. Against this backdrop, Thunderbolts continued to fly. They escorted bombers when required. They patrolled transport corridors. They strafed rail lines, bridges, convoys, and retreating columns. They hunted locomotives and armored vehicles. They suppressed flak positions before ground offensives. They returned with bullet holes and oil streaks, and flew again the next day. The aircraft's adaptability became one of its greatest strategic contributions. It was not only a high-altitude escort. It was not only a bomber defender. It was not only a fighter. It was a platform capable of absorbing punishment and delivering it in return, consistently. When the Luftwaffe attempted its last major offensive action in the West during Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945, the scale of the imbalance became clear. German fighters launched surprise low-level attacks against Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. Initial damage was real. Aircraft burned on the ground. But the deeper reality was unforgiving. While the Germans lost experienced pilots they could not replace, the Allies replaced damaged Thunderbolts within days. Production lines in the United States had not slowed. Factories at Farmingdale and Evansville had turned out over 15,000 P-47s during the war. Engines, parts, ammunition, and trained aircrew flowed across the Atlantic in steady streams. The Thunderbolt represented more than engineering. It represented capacity, and capacity wins prolonged wars. In the air, the aircraft's 850 caliber machine guns continued to speak with mechanical consistency. They did not depend on rare alloys or fragile components. They were rugged, electrically heated against freezing temperatures, and supplied with ammunition in quantities that allowed pilots sustained engagement. German fighter pilots increasingly faced a mathematical problem. Even when skill allowed them to close on an opponent, they had limited seconds to strike effectively before defensive fire saturated the air. And if their attack failed to destroy the Thunderbolt outright, the American pilot often retained the speed to disengage. By early 1945, Allied air superiority over Western Europe was overwhelming. The Luftwaffe's operational sorties declined sharply due to fuel scarcity. Aircraft that did rise often did so in desperate conditions, flown by young pilots with minimal combat time. Against seasoned Thunderbolt squadrons, many of whose pilots had accumulated dozens or even hundreds of missions, the disparity was stark. Control of altitude, once contested, was now assumed. Thunderbolts roamed above advancing Allied armies as mobile guardians. On the ground, German troops developed instinctive reactions to their presence. The deep rolling thunder of a diving radial engine signaled imminent danger. Columns halted, soldiers scattered for cover. Camouflage nets became routine. Movement by daylight grew increasingly hazardous. The psychological effect was cumulative. A weapon that had once seemed too heavy to dominate air combat had become synonymous with omnipresence. Its kill ratios in aerial engagements reflected disciplined employment rather than dramatic dueling. It did not win through individual heroics alone, though many of its pilots achieved ace status. It won through system, altitude advantage, coordinated attack patterns, mechanical reliability, and numerical reinforcement. The Thunderbolt was rarely alone. It flew in elements, in flights, in squadrons stacked vertically. It integrated into a broader Allied doctrine that linked radar, intelligence, bomber streams, escort fighters, and ground operations into a single operational ecosystem. The Germans had refined tactical brilliance in the early years of the war, but brilliance without fuel, without replacement pilots, without industrial scale, eroded under sustained pressure.